Hi, Rohan. We'll wait for a couple of minutes for people to join, and then we'll start.
Sure.
Uh, Hi, everyone. Good morning. Shall we start this webinar? Okay. Thank you. So, hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I have with me Rohan. He's a senior partner at AZB, and uh, my name is Kunwar Vivek Singh, KVS, and I look after the GoTrust technology. And we will be discussing how do we build a smart consent manager based on the new DPDP requirement that we have in the market. And yeah, in case you have any questions, or while we're doing the presentation, in case you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat, and maybe in the end we will have a small Q&A session to answer all of those. Let's start. I think let's move to the slides. So, okay. So, Rohan, from the Act perspective, do you have some overview of the requirements are?
Yeah, thanks, Kumar. I think this subject is very critical for anyone and everyone who is looking at DPDP compliance, because I think the Indian data protection regime on data, which I think places heavy reliance on consent as the basis for processing of personal data, makes it very important for businesses and organizations which are handling personal data, which qualify as data fiduciaries, to ensure that you are putting a lot of emphasis on not just what does the consent is about, what is the consent about, but also how it is collected, and whether you are able to maintain adequate accountability standards in terms of how consent is being collected and what records are being maintained. So let's take a step back. Now, when we talk about the DPDP Act, the law places, I think, heavy reliance on consent as the basis of processing of personal data, as opposed to some of the other geographies like EU, where there are several other grounds available, such as performance of contract or legitimate interest. In India, if you are looking at using personal data for any purpose, you will ultimately need to go back to the individual, the data principal, and ensure that they are able to exercise their rights. The quality of the consent under the new law, the DPDP Act, is also of a certain kind. It is not good enough to simply say that I have a tick box on my platform and somebody clicks and that is good enough. The consent requirement now is very prescriptive in nature. It needs to be free, it needs to be specific, it needs to be informed, unconditional, unambiguous, and with a clear affirmative action. The fundamental difference in the way the consents have been obtained so far under the law and what is required in the future is that now the consent will need to be demonstrated to be informed consent, which means that individuals who are parting with their personal data need to have the real choice, the real decision making power with respect to how their data is going to be used. And I think that is going to be fundamental in terms of how data fiduciaries need to build their systems, need to build their consent life cycle in a manner where consent management is central to their DPDP compliance. There is also a concept of consent manager under the data protection law. Both the DPDP Act and the rules shed some light in terms of what is a consent manager and what are those requirements. I would want to clarify one aspect which I think is very often misunderstood. There's a difference between consent management system (CMS) versus a consent manager as a entity which is performing a certain function for data fiduciaries. A consent manager is actually performing like an agent kind of a function for individuals, helping them, aiding them, assisting them in exercising their rights to provide consent, revise consent, withdraw consent, and take actions with respect to how their data is going to be used by data fiduciaries. This is not what an organization which qualifies as a data fiduciary needs to do. The consent manager is actually performing a function for the data principal. Consent management system, as it is called, the CMS, is something which fiduciaries need to build in. It's a tool, it's a mechanism which you need to have in place in order to ensure that there is adequate accountability. Whatever consents are being collected are easily traceable. You are able to maintain logs. There is verifiability with respect to how those consent logs are being maintained. And as and when the individual makes decisions with respect to his or her data, the data fiduciary is able to action those, let's say, instructions which are being given by the individual. The law, I think, today does not shed light in terms of how is a consent manager going to integrate with the data fiduciaries. But data fiduciaries, as a concept itself, will need to ensure that whatever data is being collected by them is used for only the specified purposes for which the data is being collected. If a purpose changes, if there are changes in terms of how the individual wants his or her data to be used by the data fiduciary is bound and responsible to ensure that they are able to make those decisions active. In other words, if I change my mind and I don't want my data to be processed anymore, I should be given a choice to withdraw my consent. If I don't want to, let's say, allow the data fiduciary to use my data for certain XYZ purposes, I should be able to amend or update my consent. So I think all in all, the consent management framework under the DPDP Act is central to the manner in which data fiduciaries need to comply with the law. Especially in India, there is heavy focus and reliance, as I said, on consent as a basis. And I think it is in that background, some of the tools, some of the, I think, technical standards which need to be put in place by fiduciaries are going to be important to automate this mechanism for consent management.
Excellent introduction to the Act. Thanks, Rohan. Team, what we'll do is that we already have some slides. As some of it Rohan has already covered. What we'll do is that there are sections where we'll look at the law, how it defines it, and then the some of the tools. I mean, primarily GoTrust, how we try to help enterprise bridge that gap. So I think we'll move on to the next slide. So this is the legal foundations that Rohan was talking about. Some of it is like there are specific sections defined, like what is the Rohan has already said that there has to be a clear purpose, specific notice before collecting personal data. So that is like how government is giving this right to individuals to that, so that they are fully aware of where their data is being used. So it's like right to privacy is what these foundations are. So and similarly, that user has the complete right to withdraw the consent or change the consent and do it at every time. And similarly, the sections 8 and rule 4. Maybe Rohan, if you want to add to that section 8 and rule 4.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think four I've already touched upon. I think the role of a consent manager. Consent manager, as I said, is going to be an entity which is going to register with the Data Protection Board. the entity which performs the function of a consent manager um, will also need to fulfill certain obligations, will have certain standards to meet. So the rules provide abundant clarity in terms of what is eligibility criteria, what are the guardrails within which a consent manager needs to operate. But I think more importantly, the role of the consent manager there is going to be performing some kind of an intermediary function between the fiduciary and the data principal. Because at the end of the day, the data belongs to the individual and the data is now being used by the fiduciary. So what consent manager is really doing is facilitating this process to allow the data principal to give consent, manage consent, and withdraw consent, which I think we have rightly put it. Um, as far as the obligation or data fiduciary are concerned, I think notice and consent, of course, is the central theme around which all these obligations flow. But more importantly, you will also need to ensure as a data fiduciary that your systems are built in a manner that you are able to provide auditability. So tomorrow, if say Data Protection Board uh, is receiving some kind of complaints or grievances against any of your activities connected to personal data, you should be able to have audit trails, you should be able to have logs, you should be able to build mechanisms in order to clearly demonstrate that when the data was collected, it was only used for the purpose for which it was provided. And there is also going to be, I think, a lot of relevance in terms of ensuring that you have the adequate technical and organization standards which you put in place. Unless and until have you have the system sophistication to differentiate why a particular data set is being provided for what reason, and you're only limiting your use to that purpose, I think that is going to help. The issue which often comes across, and this is a practical issue across organizations, is you may collect data for a purpose A, but tomorrow now you want to use data for a purpose B. What do you do? In such a scenario, you will have to ensure that your consents are structured in a manner that whenever the data is now going to be used for purpose B, in my example, there is adequate opportunity given to the data principal to update their consents in order to now allow the data fiduciary to use it for another purpose. So I think these are some mechanisms which will need to be put in place. I think as far as uh, the notice requirement is concerned, I think couple of things which one will need to be very, very careful. The principle of purpose limitation and data minimization are going to be very important while formulating any kind of a notice. Purpose limitation would mean you must ensure that you are limiting the processing of personal data only to the purpose which is called out in the notice. That is number one. And number two, there is always going to be a desire for data fiduciaries to collect more and more personal data. But unfortunately, the DPDP Act doesn't allow for that. DPDP Act says you should only collect those data attributes or elements which are necessary for you to perform a certain purpose for which you have collected. So it doesn't mean that if I'm operating, say in my example, a social media platform, I have no license to uh, collect the blood group or health records of my customers because it's not necessary, it's not required. So data minimization is going to be very relevant in those scenarios. So I think that to me, I think Kumar is going to be the basis or the foundation on which the DPDP compliance is going to happen.
Excellent point, I think. So just everyone, I think I saw a question from Akhtar. So what we'll do is that we'll take the question maybe at the end of the webinar. So that would be helpful. So please keep putting in the questions or the doubts that we have. Now we move on to the next section. So section 8, I think this is what you covered in most of the content. So yeah, let's move on to the next section. So some of the points, why do we need a smart consent manager? So like Rohan already explained, and the law already enforces that we'll have to make sure that we build the right tools, controls, and levers into the data of the organization to ensure that we keep the keep the consent as per the required legal basis. So there is there's a requirement of having a right legal basis for you to collect the information. So like Rohan already, you already I think covered that point, that if you are a social media platform, you probably may not need uh, a blood group or a PHI information, so and so on and so forth. So some of the points are mentioned here. I will just probably read it through for people to understand. So it's like ensure that the lawful processing of every data element. So the lawful is where the data minimization for fiduciary will come into play. Is like you have to be sure that for what legal basis you are using the data. So that is one part of it, and then provide real-time visibility into consent status. So that is where the rights for individuals are given to the individual, so that they can go and check at what point in time, for what businesses, for what legal entities within my data is being used, for what purpose. So that is the real-time visibility for the end user, for the data principles, is what it does. And uh, uh, Rohan, would you want to cover the next 2 points, maybe in for the eliminating inconsistency in the purpose-based processing? If there is something that
Yeah, so
you
I think any consent management system will need to ensure that whatever data attributes are being collected and used are linked to a certain identified purpose. As I said, the moment that purpose gets over, the purpose doesn't survive, you have no business to retain that data. So your systems will also need to have some kind of, I think, integration with your purposes, which means
yeah.
that whenever your purposes are fulfilled, you will need to build some kind of mechanisms to ensure that your consent management system gets that notification and you are not retaining that data element for a certain purpose. So this to me, I think, is going to be very, very critical to any kind of a CMS, where not only at the time of collection, even whenever you are using any data uh, which is there in your repository, you must be able to validate that what is the purpose for which it is being used. And if that purpose is not surviving anymore, as I said, you should be able to withdraw or allow for the customer to withdraw that consent or not use that data anymore. I think that is going to be central. The other aspect, which is also important to any personal data governance, is security standards which you build as an organization to ensure that there are access controls, there are safeguards in place so that there are no accidental or, let's say, unauthorized use of personal data. Whenever there is consent provided for any processing of personal data, there is obviously going to be a mechanism need to be provided for withdrawal of that consent as well. So, from a data fiduciary perspective, it is not just going to be about lip service anymore. It is not good enough to put uh, language in your notice when you are not able to meet some of those requirements. So you need to walk the talk. You need to have mechanisms to ensure that whatever purposes are being called out, whatever data is being collected, it is only used for those purposes. And the moment it, as I said, changes, you are giving the data principle the autonomy, the choice, and the right to decide how their data is going to be used in the future.
Excellent, I think. Yeah. So the other 2 points that are mentioned on the slides, I think these cover this is like the outcome that we expect. Like we want users to have stronger trust with the organization. Their data is not being used for the purposes other than that what we have consented for. And the second part is, yeah, okay, now you move to the next slide. So so this is not an issue. So this is the current gap that we have in the organization's data ecosystem, like the consent ecosystem. Just before we get into this slide, I think Rohan, you have already stressed on that point that there are two. One is consent manager, which is like a central authority which uh, uh, is the custodian of the rights of the individual data principles. And then there is a consent management system, CMS, what we can call it as just to avoid confusion, which is the one which the organizations have to implement to ensure that they have these capabilities for the individual data principals to manage and execute their rights. So this is I think some of it is what we have already covered. Like the current problem, the current gap in the market is like the within an organization, when the consent is collected for one part of the system, the consent information is flowing into multiple systems. Like suppose we have already taken an email ID or a phone number for say on a website when you log in, but that is for suppose for an e-commerce platform. If you're logging to that system, but the information then goes into multiple other channels or multiple other functions like marketing or promotions or whatever. So there are multiple channels that it gets into. So that is the problem that currently the organizations, the data fiduciary uh, okay, so the data fiduciary is facing. So that is what the first point is, that the consent record is stored across different tools in the system. So that is where the CMS, the consent management platform, is what we're talking about, will come into play. That no single view of the valid or expired consent. So this is also like you have given a consent, but there's no central view, because somebody is collecting consent on a mobile phone, somebody is collecting it on a web. There are different departments that are working with different set of tools, different set of SaaS applications, so on and so forth. So as an organization, as a data fiduciary, we do not have a centralized view of consent for individual, and that is what the second point is. And then the third point is about the real time withdrawal of the consent. So what happens is, if what happens when the data fiduciary withdraws the consent, will in that case the I mean, suppose I withdraw my consent from my e-commerce platform, will the team be sending me the marketing mails after the I've withdrawn? So with a smart consent management system, this should happen real time, that as soon as we as a data principal withdraw the consent, it should get into the it should trickle down to the downstream systems of the data fiduciary, and should ensure that the data is not further used for the purpose for which I have withdrawn the consent. So, Rohan, I think maybe for the last point, I mean, the others are, I think, last 2 points are for the regulators from the legal perspective. So, if you just want to add to that.
Yeah, so I think already spoke about the fact that mapping of consent vis-a-vis purpose and the activity is going to be very important. You
Yeah.
need to have audit ready logs, so that tomorrow, if there is any enforcement action where the data protection board wants to understand what kind of consents have you obtained, were they valid, were they justified, you should have logs in order to demonstrate it. And last as well, I think the risk of unlawful processing. If consents have, let's say, been withdrawn, they are not valid anymore. One should also ensure that you are able to build mechanisms so that whenever you get a notification that the consent has been withdrawn, that processing also needs to automatically stop. If you continue processing the data despite there being no valid consent existing, I think obviously there are going to be risks of penalties under the Data Protection Act. So I think that is something which is going to be very, very important.
Excellent. Yeah, I think let's move on to the next slide, please. So this is a GoTrust offering on the consent manager part of the system. So whatever challenges that we covered in the previous slide, so tries to answer most of this concern by being a centralized consent manager platform for the data fiduciary. So there are multiple ways. I mean, I can cover the specific points later, but just to give you an overview of it, how we I mean, do the consent implementation is that we'll, I mean, so the idea is that we build a connection to the enterprise systems and then give them a centralized view of the consent that they're collecting from different platforms, different say web app, mobile app, and centralized. And of course then keep the immutable logs of all the consent actions that are happening within that ecosystem, like which department is taking the consent for what purpose, and what is the whether it's a really valid consent or not. So just to cover the points, I think it it's like the first one is the immutable logs of all the consent and withdrawal action. So once we build these connectors and systems into using the GoTrust platform, the data fiduciary can then configure the mode of consent collection as well. Like there are multiple modes of consent connection. Like you can have a form-based consent collection, or you can also have a physical form getting uploaded into a digital system. So all of that aggregation of the consent happens through the platform, and then every activity is tracked on the platform. So you get an immutable logs of whatever actions happening on the consent or using the consent. And because it's a centralized system, the automatic enforcement of withdrawal also happens. So what happens is that the user, the data principals get the uh, preference center for their consent. So at any point in time, they can log into this preference center, and based on their requirement, they can withdraw the consent or upgrade the consent. And then all of this system, because it's centrally connected to the data fiduciary system, it trickles down to the each of the systems. And yeah, the third point is, I think, similar to what we have already covered. And the fourth is where I think the legal part of the action will be, like with the purpose driven aligned consent templates. So this is where we along with the organization data fiduciaries work and look at the exact purpose for which the consent is being taken right now. Look at the gaps. If we have to be more explicit about the consent and purpose. And so we already have say around 50 plus templates for different domains, different organization types, that is built in. But of course, this requires a common common actionable process between the legal function and the domain in which the organizations operate in. And yeah, and the third point is real-time synchronization across internal systems. So once we look at once the integrations are done, the GoTrust systems automatically does the synchronization. Just a point, Rohan, I think on the purpose-aligned consent templates. So do you kind of have a different? I mean, in terms of legal requirement, do you see something there as well?
So I think it's an important one because consent artifacts need to be built in order to ensure that you have the relevant data fields. You will have the metadata associated with every consent which is being obtained. There will be a log which will perhaps have what are the data elements which are being collected, what is the purpose code, uh, and if there is a certain timeline or a certain specific, I think, uh, purpose which is being given, it should be able to track that so that tomorrow, if there is any change to the consent which is being provided by data principal, that consent artifact can be suitably modified and amended in order to suit the requirement of the data principal. So alignment of purpose, yes, starts with the data principal providing a consent, but it may evolve over a period of time. And what these, I think, systems will have to do as a part of the CMS is also factor in the changes which principles are going to make over a period of time.
And I think for once the purposes changes, I think it has to be revalidated. Reconsent has to be taken from data principles.
That is absolutely correct.
Okay, so at all point in time, it has to be an explicit consent with explicit purpose, with explicit legal basis.
Absolutely right. So whenever any consent is being provided, even if there is any modification, any change or withdrawal for that matter, there will need to be a real-time integration in terms of how the systems are going to process the personal data. Because all of this process is likely to be an automated process. Very difficult to have human beings, let's say, update these instructions from time to time. So I think it is tools like GoTrust My Senses which are going to then help in automating some of the solutions. And I just want to be very clear: this is the CMS for a fiduciary what we are referring to.
Yeah,
This is not a consent manager role which GoTrust is playing, say, for a data principal.
absolutely right. Yeah, let's move on to the next one.
I think we
So Yeah.
touched upon all these things. There will be a clear proof of valid consent. Should be a proof of withdrawal with timestamps. This is the metadata which I was talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
There should be instant suspension of any unlawful processing. If the consent has been withdrawn, it has been changed, you must have mechanisms to automatically stop the processing of that personal data. So end-to-end life cycle visibility is what is going to be important. Right from the time the consent was collected to when it was updated to which when it was withdrawn, I think that visibility should be provided to the individual so that they are able to take a decision in terms of how the data is being used.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the GoTrust consent manager does all of it, and like we've also put it in the slide. So I think we can move on to the next one. I think this also covers a similar part of it. So this I think is saying. I mean, most of it is what we have already discussed. Like how do we integrate with the different systems existing in the enterprise, and how do we ensure the clear audit evidences for the consent across the life cycle of the consent. So I think we will move on to the next one. Oh, it's done. So let's probably have a look at the questions that we have, if we have something.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
Akhtar's question is, what is the government's criteria to decide whether a company is the SDF or not? So today, the government has called out some factors based on which they're likely to classify certain categories of data fiduciaries as SDF, significant data fiduciaries. So if certain organizations are handling large volumes of data, uh, certain scenarios where they may be handling sensitive data, the government is likely to come out with some kind of a categorization for some of these businesses, which may be considered to be significant data fiduciaries. Now, while you are expected to comply with all the obligations of a data fiduciary, which are there under DPDP, being an SDF, there will be certain incremental requirements. You need to undergo periodic audits for your data. You will have to do a DPI, a data protection impact assessment. You may even need to appoint a data protection officer on a full-time basis. So I think some of these things are going to be incremental if you become an SDF. Do we know who are going to qualify as SDF right now? Most likely is going to be some of the large organizations, banks, financial institutions, who are likely to fall within this categorization. But today, the government has not come out with any kind of prescriptive list. But these are certain factors one should keep in mind. So if you're a organization which is handling large volumes of data, sensitive data, health data, etc., you should be mentally prepared that you may fall within this categorization.
Excellent. That brings to us to the end of this webinar. Uh, thank you everyone, and thanks Rohan for very insightful discussion.
Thanks, Kunwar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.